Afternoon and welcome. I'm Amy Haggard, Assistant Director of Alumni and Student Engagement for Honor Scholars and Fellows, and I'm happy to be here today on behalf of our Alumni Network Friends of HSF, but also working collaboratively with the Office of National Fellowships to bring you our great alumni speaker, Jesse Marks. First, we would like to acknowledge, however, this difficult time for our African American students, faculty, staff, and alumni. We appreciate any opportunity to address issues of social justice and equity, and we will be working collaboratively to do this in the near future. We are thankful that you have chosen to take time today to engage in our virtual community. Thank you. With that, I would like to introduce Josh Sanic, the Associate Director of the Office of National Fellowships. Josh?
Yeah, hi, thank you. My job here is really just to introduce Jesse Marks and to moderate the questions that many of you submitted. And if you do have more questions, Amy's going to be keeping an eye on the chat box. And so just please feel free to submit them there, and we will circle back to them and ask them on your behalf. Without further ado, let me go ahead and introduce Jesse. Jesse actually transferred to Florida State University from Florida State College of Jacksonville in 2013 to complete a bachelor's degree in Middle Eastern Studies. During his undergraduate career, he visited the Middle East on several occasions, once for 8 months as a Boren Scholar. After his degree, he worked for the Stimson Center, a DC-based think tank, as a Scoville Fellow, and then he returned to Jordan to do research on international refugee resettlement plans as a Fulbright Scholar, and that was also about 8 to 12 months. Inspired by these experiences in Jordan, Jesse has taken on 2 master's degrees, one at the University of Cambridge, which he completed in 2019, and the second one at Tsinghua University in China as a Schwartzman Scholar in 2020. He defended his dissertation this past weekend, so I'm assuming that it went well since you're here and not doing read right. Jesse
still catching up on sleep.
Yeah. Jesse now lives in Washington, D.C., where he's working with the Department of Defense as a McCain Fellow. He's a Presidential Management Finalist. He is a writer who's published in several news outlets, including the Washington Post, the Foreign Affairs, and Defense One. And he's a research associate with the Cambridge Center for the Study of Global Human Movement. Jesse Marks, welcome back to FSU in this virtual space.
Thanks, it's been way too long. Appreciate it. It's nice to see you all again.
And so again, please, if you have questions, do not hesitate to send them into the chat, and we will circle back to them. I've sort of broken this up into a few different categories. So we're going to first just walk us through your FSU or undergraduate experience, including the fellowships, and then sort of circle into your life now. So if you don't mind, just starting with you enrolled at FSU as a transfer student from Florida State College of Jacksonville. What was that like? Because I do believe we have some transfer students in the audience. What was that transition like? And can you tell us what you did to make Tallahassee and FSU your home as quickly as you did?
Yeah, absolutely. It was an interesting transition. It was honestly my first time. I'm beyond the Middle East for a couple months, the few summers before that, actually moving away from home. It was interesting. Thankfully, I had my sister, who I think is on the call, who was finishing her degree at FSU at the same time. So this really helped significantly. She's always been a strong source of love and support and camaraderie, because we both work on Middle East and Arabic. But getting to FSU for me was a bit of a different transition. I think finding my community took time. But the benefit, I guess, that I found with kind of moving into a smaller program at the time was that the program faculty, so Dr. Zaina, who I think I saw in here, and Dr. Peter Gerritsen, who is since retired, ultimately became kind of like my family in many ways. And then around that community, I began to build my student community at FSU. So there was a lot of, conversations over coffee about the Middle East and history. It was just kind of getting my feet wet. FSU had a lot to offer. Everything from the fellowship office, which I had the previous privilege of meeting Dr. Filer before I'd actually arrived at FSU, but also stretching to the international student communities. I was teaching English, foreign language. It was a lot to kind of consume. But I was very grateful that the Middle East Center kind of served as kind of my base. And from there, I kind of expanded out. By the end of my first semester, I think I had gotten a good handle of FSU and kind of created a core group of students that I'd become good friends with. And that provided the foundation for me to become more heavily involved in other areas of campus. So like by my second and third semesters, I was basically got pretty heavily involved in student government, as well as other groups on campus. Like we had a refugee advocacy group that started back then. We were working with resettling Syrians to Tallahassee, and we did a fair bit of political engagement at the Capitol as well. So yeah, FSU really quickly became a home. I mean, the FSU community it's very big. It's 42,000 students, but it's also really small in that same sense. We get to know everyone really quickly. And that's something I found very special about FSU, even among other communities that I've been a part of.
So it seems as though like finding those niches where you could engage with people who share those similar passions created those small spaces for you to make Tallahassee and FSU feel like a small place and a home.
Yeah, a lot of it is, creating family in the midst of where your blood family might not be. It's creating, other forms of family.
Yeah. And so when you said you were an English conversation partner, was that with the Center for Intensive English Studies or the Center for Global Engagement or both?
It was with CIE. It was actually a mix of both. So I was really heavily involved in the coffee hour. Highly encourage you all to go. Honestly, one of the best organizing and just attending. But I also did the Teaching English as a Foreign Language program at CIE, which is really another fantastic program. Got to meet a lot of students from some of my good friends at the time, from Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, all the way to Brazil, China. It was really a cool community of people.
Cool. Thank you. How did you settle on what you wanted to study? As I recall from previous conversations that we've had, at one point you were an archaeology major.
Yeah, so when I was at community college, I focused on archaeology and anthropology. There was another side of me that had the dream of wanting to be a musician, so I spent a lot of my time growing up playing music. Honestly, it was a period of traveling to Jordan from 2010, 11, and 12. Prior to going to FSU, I was there for part of the Arab Spring protests in 2011 and 2012. And I had been actively engaging at that time with Iraqi, Palestinian, and the early Syrian refugees who were coming across the border. And those communities were really just fantastic folks I'd gotten to meet. And getting to speak with them, I learned about their struggles and essentially something I had very little engagement and knowledge of, growing up in the South in Florida, of what it was like to be displaced, the unique struggles that they face in Jordan. And that really cemented my interest and wanting to pursue not just regional studies, but particularly looking functionally at refugee issues, things like civilian protection, and those are interlinked with conflict and a few other areas that I've pursued since then. But FSU really provided the absolute kind of opportunity to look at the Middle East and to be able to explore these functional interests as well, like refugees and protection, conflict. So yeah, it was a pretty easy answer at that point. It was there weren't many other universities in the state of Florida that had the same prowess of both Arabic and kind of Middle East scholarship.
Very cool. And I'm guessing part of your response really leads to my next question, which is how did you make your decision to study in Jordan for Fulbright and Boren?
Yeah. So I have a lot of friends just through these processes of traveling who, I had one friend I talked to who's traveled to over 70 countries, and what an incredible experience to see the world. For me, however, I think from the time that I started going to Jordan 10 years ago, it was really the first country that I had been to outside of kind of the US bubble. And I just kept going back. I was particularly interested in wanting to gain a familiarity with one place over time. In that way, I can better understand the local context, the culture, kind of the unique experiences and the unique life. Even for me, the specific dialect. Until now, two of my closest friends that I've known since almost a decade now, we're celebrating a decade of friendship. I still keep up with on a regular basis and see them whenever I go back. So using things like Boren and Fulbright really just enabled me to kind of plant roots even deeper, not just academically, but personally, and even found a branch of my family that live in Amman, who I've gotten to know quite well over the past 2 or 3 years.
Yeah, that's a fun surprise, right?
Yeah, it's 10 years, and your father's like, "Oh yeah, so we have a cousin in Jordan." I'm like, after 7 years, no, but it's really truly it was a really beautiful moment.
On top of that, your your interest as an undergrad to work within the refugee community or work on behalf of the refugee community also seemed to be a big drive for you at the time for Boren and Fulbright. Um, uh, I think it's important if I just really quickly explain what these two things are, because
Mhm.
for a follow-up question, Fulbright funds year-long international experiences. You use that year-long to do a research project on resettlement plans, international resettlement plans. And Boren is built for specifically language and cultural immersion. But in both cases, you didn't limit yourself to just that proposal. I believe in both cases you worked pretty closely with volunteering with the UN. Is that accurate?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think the fun part and it's the interesting part about Jordan is because it's such a confluence of so many different fields and sectors and types of companies and UN organizations. Um, while I was at Florida State prior to going on Boren, like I did my honors in the major research as well as different components of like different independent research study projects on the Syrian refugee crisis. So I had a good understanding going to Jordan. So it kind of made sense to continue going there. But yeah, while I was there in Boren, had the opportunity to work for 6 months as a direct intern to the country director. And at the time, Jordan was one of the largest, if not the largest refugee response for the United Nations. So getting to work at that capacity was honestly transformative. And that led to multiple opportunities following that with working at like the Center for Strategic Studies at the University of Jordan, where I came a year later on Fulbright to do further research. So it's these things kind of created a bit of a rolling boulder down the hill, and some more opportunities emerged through them.
What would you say to an undergraduate student? Like what sort of mindset do you have to have when you enter a new country and say, I'm going to go work for the United Nations while I'm here?
Honestly, that I think that links back to Florida State, because while I was at FSU, a lot of my work with refugees brought me into direct contact with working at the state level in the Capitol, lobbying to get Syrians who were many of them were living in refugee camps in Jordan to be able to be resettled to Florida. Through those relations, I happened to meet one of the guys at the time. He was the director for UNHCR for the United States, who was just visiting Florida in passing, and he suggested I go look at Jordan. And it was one of these relationships in Tallahassee, which actually led to a meeting in DC, which led to a meeting in Jordan down the line. And the opportunity evolved. So a lot of these things are kind of happenstance. They kind of emerged from just the pursuit of what I loved. These doors were open, and when I could possibly, and as often as possible, walk through them, and really some interesting opportunities emerged from it.
Good, thank you. Were you able to ingrain yourself into the community in Jordan?
Quite easily, actually. I think the biggest thing that helped with that was just a desire to learn Arabic. Honestly, it's the key to understanding people's daily lives. Beyond kind of the professional impacts of, so beyond the research components and all these, which I think language is important for hearing people's experiences. Language is hugely transformative. For me, it gave me the opportunity to read historic texts. It gave me the opportunity to speak with my neighbors when I was living in Amman and different communities, when I was doing archaeological work, when I was on Boren and Fulbright, like I had the chance to like talk to the guys whose dialect I slowly got, who were working with me on the digs. Honestly, you need Arabic to understand just how people's lives evolve, rather than seeing the Middle East as a place that is particularly strictly through the strategic lens or the security lens. You're just seeing the Middle East for what it is, seeing the Arab communities for just the hospitality, for the love and the compassion, and just these. I don't know. It just creates a completely different type of interaction and context. For me, particularly, like understanding the puns. And Arabic was like the one-liners that people would give me in Arabic that I still lose my mind over, laughing when they say, you can, hear brilliance, their ongoing concerns and more. So that honestly was the key to just kind of putting roots on the ground and really just continuing to pursue my work there.
Very cool. And I suppose you'll allow us to infer that if Arabic and the Middle East is not your area of interest, then that same sort of learn the language, learn the culture perspective fits wherever.
Oh, absolutely. A lot of people in China that I've been studying with on Schwartzman, same thing. They went to China one day and found a love and interest in Mandarin and kept pursuing it in a very similar way. But I don't want to limit people's approach to think, oh, I should only apply for this if I have an interest in Arabic. It's, sometimes you go to a country and like when I was 17 and it was like I knew nothing about Jordan or the Middle East, and you show up there and you realize this is a really interesting place I want to get to know more about. I had a lot of people in my Boren year who had never been to the Middle East before. And same on Fulbright, there were people who had never been to the region, and they got there and they had the opportunity to study the language, and that love and interest in the area pursued following actually their joining the fellowship. So even if you're looking for an opportunity to get out and expand your knowledge, gain new experiences, broaden your horizons, definitely apply, because you don't necessarily have to know the language to do it.
And that's a great plug, because the Fulbright application is open now, and we are helping students. If you are interested,
definitely apply.
Yeah, do not hesitate to reach out. So tell us a little bit about your Scoville experience. This is a bit different, and how it fit into your trajectory.
So I applied, it was right after undergrad for me in 2016. I was working part-time for a firm doing some security work on the Middle East. But I don't know, I really had an interest in understanding civilian protection and conflict. So I've been working on refugee issues for quite a long time. And one of the issues on Syria that have been emerging was what happens when refugees begin to go back to their country, particularly to Syria. It was, at the time, still an emerging challenge. It wasn't one that was receiving a lot of focus. So I kind of wanted to take advantage of the lack of ongoing research to help fill that gap, both in terms of policy, as well as academic and even just activism, advocacy and activism, particularly understanding or at least shedding light on the specific needs of these communities. And that gave me the opportunity to do it. I mean, Scoville is really cool because it's very unique in that it emphasizes kind of the twin pillars of security and peace, and understanding how those two things work together to end longstanding conflicts. And for me, it allowed me to kind of pursue the nexus of policy, security, peace building. Stimson Center, which not very often do people, I guess I was at 23 at the age, have the chance to have a fellow title at a quite a good and well-known think tank. I think they're top 25 now. As one of the best opportunities in DC of all places, right? So you have a business card that says, "Oh, fellow," which for a 23-year-old punk kid like me was like quite a really transformative experience, because you can have conversations with people you might not traditionally have conversations with, both in government and in the field. It was a really interesting experience. I really loved it.
How do you feel, if at all, how do you feel academic research at a university differs from research at a think tank?
So research at a think tank tends to be more applied, particularly in the IR field. If you're looking at international relations, foreign affairs, it tends to be more strategic and more applied. So the emphasis is on policy recommendations, your ability to analyze information as it's happening on the ground, and being able to provide constructive, informed recommendations on how to move forward to a specific actor or group of actors. Versus academic research, I think there's a lot more freedom. I think the joke is policy people deal with exactly what's happening right now, and then academics wait until it's long over. The idea is to then be able to look back to analyze. So a lot of my academic research on Syria has focused on kind of more theoretical, the integration of like theoretical principles of like humanitarianism and political theory on national sovereignty, while my work on policies actually dealt with hard policy of how do you get civilians in conflict from point A to point B when you have like these 5 roads that are blocked by these people and you have to help them get to safety. So I think the confluence of those two things can occur in think tanks. These more, I guess they're quasi-academic institutions like Brookings and CSIS, Wilson Center have a big focus on the integration of these two things. But I think having both skill sets are really quite, it's the best way to put it. I think they're very compatible. Yeah, very much so, because you need the academic ability to analyze, to ask really important questions and find solutions to those questions. And then from those questions, you really begin to derive your recommendations. So the two things really blend. So a good skill set to practice while you're an undergrad.
Do you think that confluence is a skill set or sets of skills that you were able to apply when you were on your Fulbright almost immediately after that?
Actually, yeah, I think if anything, Fulbright was the first time that I'd done publishing while I was on Scoville. That was one of the really big opportunities with Scoville, is you can have the opportunity to think and write and produce. Fulbright was, I think, more of a thoughtful approach. So I wasn't writing like op-eds and policy commentaries as often. Rather, I was sitting kind of with my nose in a book or interviewing people, trying to understand, rather than a number of smaller strategic questions, one larger one. So we were looking at exactly, how do you help, or what does it look like in terms of policy to facilitate or manage to an active war zone. So it's a much bigger question. So we're having to, I did some work with Lena Kuridi, who is also a Fulbright fellow. So was at the University of California, San Diego. So I was able to engage, and our approach was much more academic, and I think in logic, and we had to think through a lot of very challenging theories and how to apply these to an active policy situation. But then our output was very policy oriented. So we had to look at, what should the Jordanian government do to facilitate return? How should the US government engage with the Jordanians to help in this specific? Where should they not support return because these conditions are not there and you run the risk of forcing people to go back, which is a violation of international law. So there's a lot of nuances that I was able to kind of bring together on my Fulbright from previous experiences.
So moving beyond Fulbright, you then went to University of Cambridge to earn a master's degree. And almost immediately, that beginning of that fall semester, you reached out to our director in the Office of National Fellowships and myself to say that you wanted to go to China. And I remember, well, that I can't see the connection here. Can you explain, because you convinced us. I think we literally were thinking to ourselves, let's see if we can convince us, and you did. Can you tell us about that realization of how valuable engagement with China would be for you?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think that was November. I called you, end of November, early December. I was contemplating the question of return, of refugee return, and as we think of refugee return, you think about, okay, so you have, at the time, 1.3 million refugees in Jordan, and if at some point there's some kind of movement of people back to an active war zone, we have to conceptualize where are they going back to. And it was this logical train of thought: is okay, eventually Syria is going to be rebuilt, and it's a question of who rebuilds the country. So there was then a preponderance of, okay, so the US is engaged in specific areas, the Russians are currently engaged in another area, actively supporting the Syrian government. The EU could potentially provide funding, but at the end of the day, there was not a significant actor that was either willing or had the actual capital to rebuild. So it was honestly, and then I think it was in late 2017, there had been a few discussions in China. They had held a reconstruction conference, and China was beginning to engage behind the scenes particularly on Syrian reconstruction. But in neighboring countries like Jordan, China had upped its engagement, particularly on the language of helping Jordan and other countries be center points for reconstruction. So they would actually work through Jordan and Lebanon and different countries to actually help rebuild Syria in the long run. So this created for me at least, a logical connection to refugee repatriation, because reconstruction deals directly with how those two things interact. And I had no conceptualization of China at all, very little knowledge of its domestic politics or why it would be engaged in Syria. Yet at the same time, I was in Jordan researching all of its engagements, where it was investing, why it was investing, what it was saying about its connection to Syrian reconstruction. Began to, particularly in what they were seeing happening in Jordan. And then, the opportunity for Schwartzman, I began pursuing that because it seemed like a really great opportunity to go to a top university in Beijing on a fully funded fellowship. And it has a lot of really exciting things as part of the program. But for me, the big thing was I was able to just be in Beijing and actually research and study its connection to the Middle East, which was honestly one of the coolest things I've been able to do, is go to a Syrian cafe right down the street from Tsinghua University and meet a guy from southern Syria who is from a family, like a broader family. Conversations in Arabic, sitting in Beijing with like shisha smoke in the background and like having kebab. It was mind blowing.
Did that end up being the focus of your master's this year? Did you write the thesis you initially proposed to work on, or I'm sorry, the dissertation that you initially proposed to work on?
Yeah, so it was actually a little bit broader. So the initial aim was to study Chinese engagement in Syria, but I ended up taking a more theoretical approach and actually looking at more broadly China's approach in war-torn countries. So what is China's focus on peace building? How does it engage in peace building? What does its political, economic, social engagements look like? So kind of laying a foundation for a theoretical framework for analyzing Syria. So it's kind of putting in a lot of the legwork for something that I hopefully will pursue as a PhD, is better understanding what is China's engagement in countries like Syria. And hopefully by that time we'll have more information, just because it is an emerging field and it's an emerging topic. So there's not as much literature on it. So I'm trying to do my best to take advantage to populate some of the gaps that are presently there. And then in the long run, I'll have a much longer body of research, hopefully. Maybe a book, who knows?
Do you have plans at this moment to do a PhD? Is there a deadline for you that you've set for yourself?
It depends on kind of what happens in the post-COVID period. Currently looking at going, or in the process of going into the Department of Defense. But beyond that, ideally, I've had conversations with the University of Oxford, some folks at different colleges there, about coming in and doing this topic, looking at China's engagement in peace building. But I'm particularly finding a way to kind of blend that topic with other interests that I have on like archaeology and stuff, because there's like really weird nexuses that exist on these topics. So I think being able to kind of zero in on something like that would be really exciting.
Can you tell us a little bit about what you're doing now? The Presidential Management Fellowship, the Department of Defense, anything you're allowed to talk about, I suppose?
Yeah, absolutely. So I mean, the Presidential Management Fellowship in general is a really cool opportunity for people that are coming out of grad school. It's 2 years within the US government, and you have 2 rotations. So you're based in one institution for 9 months to a year, and then you have 2 6-month rotations to other agencies. And then afterwards, depending on how well you do, you get converted into full-time service and to the competitive service. If you want to go work for the federal government, honestly, it's like one of the premier ways to get in. I'm currently a finalist for that and have been looking for opportunities through that. However, it's been a bit more challenging to move into the agencies that I have probably a greater interest in within like the Department of State, Department of Defense. However, the Department of Defense launched I'll call it a PMF type of program this year, which is very similar. It's 2 6-month rotations in the Department of Defense working for the Office of the Secretary. And it's called the McCain Strategic Defense Fellowship. Applications are coming out in January, February for the second cohort. And honestly, my cohort are some really heavy hitters, really impressive people. Yeah, went through the application for that and was very excited to be included in the first cohort. So I'm in the process of finalizing that at present.
So if you don't mind, you've applied for a lot of fellowships, both working with our office and also on your own. Did you apply for anything you didn't receive?
Yes, many times. I think it was what Marshall was. Yeah, I applied for Marshall like 4 times and was finally a finalist.
Yeah. And Rhodes, I believe, as well. Did you apply for Rhodes a couple times?
I think I did once. Yeah, 2014, I believe it was.
How do you handle rejection? I mean, obviously, you seem to be able to move beyond it pretty quickly.
That's hard. I've learned over time that I have a pretty good elasticity when it comes to rejection, in terms of like, essentially it's not this methodical. Sometimes it fluctuates, but I tend to give myself like 24 to 48 hours to kind of grieve, or be frustrated, be angry, allow myself to have, to be hurt. And then after 48 hours, or depending on that period of time, begin planning next steps toward what I wanted to pursue. I think probably the biggest period of that for me was Marshall, because I had been pursuing grad school in the UK, but particularly related to Oxford, Cambridge. It had always been a dream to attend Oxford specifically. So after Marshall, I kind of thought, well, that dream it's dead. The dramatic me. But honestly, like 48 hours later, it might have even been 3 days later, I started looking again. I was like, well, I can, there are other options to get to the UK. And honestly, other pathways open up when you get rejected for things, which is like China, became a bit more of a clear pathway, because I could actually define within the terms of, how do I want my future to be shaped to help communities that are vulnerable in conflict. And I was able to see kind of a viable pathway for research, both active steps in terms of publishing in the next few months and doing research, to the long term of doing a master's degree in this. And Cambridge came out of nowhere. Particularly, it was a 1-year program rather than a 2-year at Oxford. So instead of doing, one degree that's 2 years at Oxford, I could do 1 year at Cambridge and then pursue another year in China. So I had, the same period of education, walking away with 2 masters from 2 very good universities, but more specifically 2 communities of people that are distinctly different, that are incredibly interesting, and giving me the chance to learn about another area of the world that is both strategically interesting for my career, but also just a very interesting culture, and a really great experience getting to go to China and meet a really cool community of people. China is more than just great food and great scenery. Like, the people there are very nice, and it was really cool to get to kind of just honestly learn so much more about the world than I had conceptualized through my engagements on the Middle East.
What do you think set you apart from other applicants for these fellowships? And what do you think we, as in the students, can be doing at FSU to prepare themselves?
That's interesting. I think first I'll say the thing that fellowship applications have enabled me to do is articulate myself and my interests, my broader interests in kind of these like weird nuanced areas that most people kind of turn their heads to. Most people don't apply to fellowships, or if they do, it comes out in their writing, the sense of, issues of self-confidence and a degree imposter syndrome. A lot of my friends who know me know that, like, that's something I've struggled with for a long time, is self-confidence. I think honestly pursuing these fellowships gives you, it gives you the ability to talk through those issues with yourself, to really conceptualize who you are within the fields you want to walk in the areas you have interest in. And you can be more honest as you pursue these things with yourself about where you stand. You can basically prove to yourself that, like, you might tell yourself that you're not worth it, that you're not capable of doing these things. And then randomly you get that one opportunity where you do, and you're like, wait, interesting. Can be more honest with your ambitions. Like, I think people often feel that when they write an application, they feel that it's dishonest to who they are. But as you begin to have these conversations with yourself and with you and Dr. Filer, you can really, it's just an interesting, almost like therapeutic approach to learning a lot about yourself. And then when you begin to express those interests to other people, you can do it in a much more coherent way, to where you feel more honest about yourself and your interests and your pursuits. I think the other things that have set me explicitly apart were my engagement in the field. First, I was able to talk about the context that I wanted to go work in. I think the second was both academic and policy research. So academic research at FSU, and the pursuit of policy research while I was in the Middle East, and trying to understand how to articulate those 2 fields. And the final one was, I think, being able to have tangible examples of engagement with both the contents I want to work on professionally, as well as the context. So for me, that was peace building, refugee, security, these types of issues in the Middle East. And the nice part about that was that if you're interested in writing, for example, publications is one way to do that. Start with lower hanging fruit, find student publications, journals. FSU has several that you can write in and publish in, because then as you apply for fellowships and such, then people who are reading your application will be like, oh wow, someone else has given this person's intelligence a stamp of approval. So if X, Y, or Z person is willing to publish your work, then it means that there's a level of vetting that's happened. So it kind of gives you the secondary stamp of, like, yeah, this person is qualified for this fellowship. So yeah, I think those are the things. And in terms of what the program can do, honestly, I think the biggest thing is casting a wide net. I mean, all of you are here, everyone that's listening, because you're interested in applying for fellowships. FSU is 42,000 students, people who come from incredibly different backgrounds, first-generation college students, white, Black, Native American, Arab, whatever it might be. Honestly, it's just getting people into the door and beginning a process of learning, not just about, themselves, but like how fellowships can provide external means for opportunities that you might not have access to or might not be able to afford. Honestly, like, the fact that I've been able to do a lot of this is very thankful to the US government, because they funded a lot of my education that I probably wouldn't have been able to afford myself. And it's afforded me opportunities to go to Cambridge. I never thought that would actually ever be a dream, or that would actually ever happen. It was always a dream, and it worked. So yeah, I think those are kind of the three tangible things. But honestly, the big thing is just getting over that mental hurdle. I think a lot of people stay in their head about fellowships, and it comes out in their writing. And people can, I guess, people who are evaluating your application can read and kind of see those types of things as they're reviewing. So I think writing an honest application means being honest with yourself about what exactly you're pursuing and why you're pursuing it.
Yeah, that's well said. And I now have this recorded, so I can just share it instead of replying myself. So in all of these applications that you've done, is there one thing that you think is the most important component of an application process?
I mean, I'm inclined to say self-honesty. I mean, you need to understand what you're applying for, why you're applying for it. And you're never going to have perfect information, but as much as possible, being able to articulate why that fellowship, why this moment, why you in this fellowship in this moment. Because at the end of the day, it's a lot of this is about selling yourself, right? And so it comes across as something that is inherently dishonest, but it doesn't have to be. I honestly, the number of people that I've talked to that have evaluated applications, people that I've helped apply, for everything from Rhodes to Boren, I think there's just been this woven thread of honesty through their work. And though there is always this imposter syndrome that they have of like, okay, am I being dishonest here? Well, no, I'm not. They'll pass it along to people like you and Dr. Filer to ask, for response. Honestly, I think that I used the term honest way too many times. I think personal honesty is one of the biggest things, because it not only makes your story much more coherent, it makes your story across multiple applications predicated upon longevity. It gives you a sense of consistency. So if you if you basically are rejected from X, Y, or Z fellowship, and you have this honest narrative, like, well, this is what I'm actually pursuing. Well, that door closed, and there's 3 other doors that I can go through to continue pursuing this passion. So it kind of gives you flexibility in that sense. Yeah. Also, having other people read your work is a very practical one.
Yeah. And I think a lot of students will share their work thinking, am I being too honest here? And that's where I think another set of eyes is helpful, whether it's our office or just a friend or family member, like to be able to say, no, like I think that's, you're being honest and it's relevant and that's helpful. Or it may I think if you're concerned about those things, like sharing your work is.
Well, I mean, particularly if I can just briefly go on in terms of the role that you and Dr. Filer played. I remember my first Boren application, and it was horrible. I read it quite often. And, I go back and I see, because I might have 10 drafts for one application, which might seem like overkill. I know for you, this might be quite normal. But from draft 1 to draft 10, you can see the evidence of the feedback that you all have given, because it's always been predicated upon honesty. I've never once walked into the office and have felt that I was ever receiving what's the word, like impersonal advice. Like it was always very thoughtful, predicated upon your knowledge of me and your engagement with me. And as you work with students, at least as I have in kind of my independent engagements with people that are applying, over time you get to know that person, and you can then begin to evaluate their work more critically according to who they are. You can actually begin to be like, is this honest to yourself? Yeah. And I think that question honestly just comes with engagement. So if y'all are applying for these things, to you all out there listening, the longevity component of this is really important, is because the more you develop relationships with folks at ONF, the better they get to know you, the better you get to know them, the better you can evaluate your honesty the way, I don't know, I guess that's beneficial to you understanding who you are in this process. It was hugely transformative for me, hugely.
Yeah, I really appreciate that vote of confidence. And I think that really came out when we were like, okay, can Jesse convince us he needs to go to China? Um, did you, with all these fellowships, did you see the fellowship as like the option, plan C, or did you see the fellowship as the only plan, or plan A of several? How did you look at these opportunities?
I think it honestly depended on the opportunity. For Boren, I think basically my first 3 years going to the Middle East, it was a mix of, me using my savings after, working in fast food for a while in high school to fund it, that I got to a point where I was like, if I want to go back, I need to find a way to get someone to fund this because I can't keep affording it. The government option was a really good one just because it allowed me to go. So for me, that was kind of my only real plan for Boren. And if I didn't get it, I was just going to stay back and probably go to DC and try to do the internship process. But thankfully, I've tried my best not to pursue the normal IR student plan where you like go to DC, get an internship, work there as a research associate, an internship, and then enter the government. I tried to pursue more alternate routes, which allowed me, it made me more competitive, more broadly, for the types of jobs I wanted to get to, but it also made me, I think, a better human. That idea of, I hate using the term, I think it's a pejorative term, global citizen, but it allows you to kind of travel the world and see people, get to know people in the context in which they live, and honestly engage with ideas and thoughts that might scare us as Americans. Like living in China for me was a very interesting experience, getting to engage with folks who believe quite differently than me on a fundamental level. And it was really quite eye-opening, that type of engagement, because it gave me a respect for histories that are different than mine, cultures that are different than mine, and values that are different than mine. And I don't think those are, replaceable. So that being said, I think each fellowship contextually was different. Some were my primary and I kind of like burned other bridges, like this is the way that I'm going. I'm putting all my effort into this. I think I did that with Marshall, and it kind of burned me a bit. But honestly, that was one of the biggest wake-up calls for me, because it was like, there's not one way to get to where I want to be. There's always other pathways. There's always other options. Sometimes it just takes being creative. Sometimes it is, utilizing your networks. Other times it is pursuing abstract options. It's also been beneficial because as I've gone the pathways that I've gone, I've found better ways to go that I can no longer take, so I can help shepherd other people into those pathways. So like if you want to go to grad school in the UK, everyone tends to apply for, Fulbright, Marshall, Fulbright, or Rhodes. But we don't often think about other options like the Rotary Global Grant, which I think I had more people in my Cambridge class and that I met at Cambridge on Rotary Global Grants that were fully funded to Oxford or to Cambridge than I did on Marshall or Rhodes that came from the US. There's always alternate routes, and it just takes a bit of creativity and flexibility to be able to identify them.
Yeah. So I actually do use the term global citizen in the next question, and
that's fine.
Okay, there's a mix of who wrote what question, and this one I have to take the credit for.
No worries.
So bear with me. Since the start of your undergraduate career, you've spent extensive time in Jordan, the United Kingdom, and China. In a world that seems increasingly polarized and in a country that seems increasingly insular, what does the global citizen have to offer, and are they being heard?
That's interesting. I think the easiest way to answer this question, which is hard, is what global citizens have to offer is informed person-to-person interactions. If you think about global politics, this is probably a bit more of a constructivist approach. We think about great state competition, US, China going at it, Russia, competition over Syria, internationalized civil wars, this whole thing. But at the bulk of the day, those are groups that are made up of individuals making decisions with other individuals. I think we've seen, more importantly, how relationships have become more important over time, whether that's interrelations between world leaders, or whether that's these track two approaches where you have academics from one country going to another country, or these student-to-student exchanges like Fulbright, Boren, or Nestle Y for those that did it in high school. The world's increasingly globalized. I think we've seen that with COVID-19. And I think these relationships are critical for learning to work effectively and pragmatically, both across borders, both across values. I think approach issues of states that are rising in the global environment. But again, I think those interactions are really predicated upon informed people who, even if they don't fully understand another person's position, have the language of empathy to at least be able to conceptualize a way another person is coming from. I think it was, what was his name? Kaiser Guo used the term intellectual empathy, cognitive empathy. The idea that you can try to conceptualize the approach that the contender that you are facing is thinking. So recognizing not just where they're coming from, but what motivates their position. I think that's critical, because then you can conceptualize the struggles of other people. And even if you can't conceptualize the struggles of other people, you can at least try to find the language of sympathy. And that creates a greater veracity for interaction, predicated upon mutual respect, rather than based in solely the language of, it's not competition, not that competition is a bad thing. It's just language that is predicated upon like absolute competition without any kind of give. And I think for the US, the programs that really push that were things like Fulbright. And I think I know that it's facing a threat for cuts and has consistently over time. But I think those types of things and those programs are absolutely necessary to address the global challenges that are coming. And in terms of whether they're being heard, I would probably argue absolutely. Actually, no, I know for sure they are. I think it's the language and the methods by which people are communicating now, we often do not see. Outside the United States, I think for me at least, it's more evident that people who I would define as global citizens, using that term, are actively engaging with one another to address these challenges. Coming back to the US, being in DC, of course, I think it's easier to see because DC is a very internationalized place. But the US is a really large country, as is China, as is Russia. So I think sometimes in large countries, it's easy to kind of get lost in the size. So we tend to see people who have been raised in one place that have never moved from that location for a really long time, as opposed to other countries that are smaller, that are much more internationalized due to globalization. People are kind of forced into broader thinking in those situations. So I think they're being heard. I think it's just in a different way. I think the bigger issue now is people in these large countries that are driving globalization need to become more educated on the impact that they have on the rest of the world, rather than what the rest of the world is. I guess the impact of the rest of the world on them just like reflects the relationship. That's a harder question.
Yeah, and more difficult just because it's of importance right now. Sort of along the same lines, sort of recognizing, as Amy was saying, like the tense situation in the United States. I was thinking a little bit about some of what you've told me about your experiences in Jordan, and I remember you talked a lot about, as part of your work, you were reading a lot of the stories of many refugees I think on a daily basis, it seemed, and I know those days could be really challenging for you. So, considering the circumstances we're in right now, I'm hoping you can share a little bit about how you took care of yourself during those times when you were reading learning some very intense stories about individuals.
Yeah, absolutely. Honestly, I think I'm still very much learning to do that. That's probably been one of the hardest parts of working in this is, for me, I think it's been a balance of recognizing my positionality as, a white male working abroad. I have a distinct privilege of being able to walk away from that work at any point in time that I feel stressed. I can close my phone and not have to talk to anyone. And then finally, like my direct connections that I have with the people that I work with. Over the last 2 years, I've become more increasingly engaged person-to-person interactions with IDPs, internally displaced Syrians, in camps across Syria. So the work becomes more abject and involved in my daily life. So I think recognizing first and foremost that positionality is like, that's where the struggle emerges, right? As a white male American who is choosing to engage in this work, I could just simply choose not to do it and walk away. For me, I don't think that's ever an option. I don't think I'll allow myself to have that option. I think it's dishonest to the interest of the work that I do. That being said, I have had to learn to balance engagement to avoid getting burned out. I think that often is the hard thing. For me, thankfully, a lot of the things that I enjoy as hobbies and probably the nerdier parts of me, like my link to history and culture and language. So like I really enjoy listening to Arabic music. I play music like the oud and different instruments. I enjoy reading history to better understand, the region that I'm working on and the people and the culture. I'm currently going through a book right now on the history of British and French relations over, the drawing of the Sykes-Picot borders to better understand the role that like Arab nationalism played. And that's just solely on the academic side that I can kind of escape from just the world that I'm in to better understand that because I'm a history buff. The other thing is honestly, I just get out. I'm a huge rower. After Cambridge, I like fell in love with rowing, weirdly enough. And it was a good release. It was a good way to get outside, to engage with my fellow classmates. The English countryside is quite beautiful. The water is a bit gross, but just a really exciting way to get out. So I think finding hobbies is of course critical. Finding ways to mentally just not focus on really anything, and recognize that though basically to I guess not burn out, prevent burnout. Because sometimes it's better to be in a good headspace to address challenges that are very heavy. And if you're doing so from a distress perspective, it can impact, your analysis or your processing in terms of how to protect these people or how to provide assistance or even how to just communicate with them, right?
Yeah.
I think those are important things.
Absolutely. Okay, I'll ask one light question and then we'll turn it over to the audience. So I because of COVID, I think we're all devouring a lot more media than we probably have been in the past, whether that's Netflix, podcasts, or books. Is there any single like show, movie, book, comic that you would like to recommend for us to enjoy?
It depends. Let me think. So I'm currently, the two books I'm going through right now, I'm going through one called A Bed for a Night by David Reef, and it's kind of a history. It's very academic, I apologize, but it's like a history of humanitarianism. I found it to be just a really insightful book. The other is I'm currently going through Susan Rice's My Story of Things Worth Fighting For, which has also been kind of more of a light reading and kind of understanding her struggle in the context of where we're at in US politics. I found it to be a really good book, particularly because historically, I think when I was younger and getting into foreign policy, I existed in a community where there was a lot of contention with her policies and a lot of views about her. So for me, the way to kind of better understand was just to read and to understand. And it's been very, very insightful and informative. So just probably things that I'll be reading will be better educating myself as, my positionality as a white male in the South and what that means in terms of things like racism and systems and structures that I exist in, that I benefit from, and how to begin to promote justice in a better way. So I think that's going to be, that will be the next kind of focus on that. In terms of things that are not academically focused and reading, trying to think, I've been watching a lot of recent kind of Middle Eastern films that have come out. There's a famous series that came out last Eid called Al-Haiba, which is like this like love story in like Lebanon, which is pretty good, I found. I watched Space Force, was not a huge fan. For all of you fans of The Office, I found it lacking. If you have Netflix, I'd encourage you to go watch something called The Gift. It is a Turkish series, and it basically is this kind of like, almost like indie, it's hard to explain, but it's a really, really interesting insight into kind of like, I don't know, Turkish cinema. I found it really quite interesting. It was really good. It's also on Netflix, free. It's a good one.
Thank you. All right. Well, Amy, I'm turning over to you to ask the questions from our audience.
Yeah, thank you. Great stuff, Jesse. It's so interesting to hear your story and your journey. We do have just a few questions.
Excellent.
That were submitted. Let me go back up to the top where they are. So one of our listeners said that it was very interesting hearing you talk about when you were in China and the peace building, and they wanted to know if you had any initial reading sources you'd recommend regarding that experience?
Ooh, so like China's peace building more broadly. Let me think. I can actually pull up my dissertation. I have it on my computer. There was one specific paper or book that recently came out that I would highly suggest. And while you're students at FSU and you're taking the summer off or you're at home, you have access to the library, so no excuses because you can actually download the books. Or worst case, so one of them is by an author, sorry, Kuo. Yes, so one of them is by a guy named Stephen Kuo. And Kuo has a recent book that just came out on China's engagement in Africa, which I think is a really good read in understanding, trying to find the specific title. Yes, so it is. That was a very interesting one that I had come across. Again, I think released in 2019. Okay. And there was another distinctive one. How about this? I will send you both of the references. Perfect. And you can share them if you'd like. That might be easier than me just you guys watching me scroll through my dissertation.
I have the student's name, so I will make sure and follow up with her. She did have a more lighthearted follow-up question, though. She wanted to know what was your favorite food in Jordan?
Favorite food? Oh, mansif for sure. Mansif is like, lamb mixed with curdled, like dried curdled cheese, technically. So I actually have some I attempted making the other day. I'm assuming this is Rawan Abhari.
Yes. Yes.
Okay, nice. I see the applauding on the screen. Yeah. Right on. Mm-hmm. So I actually attempted making mansif last week and it turned out just a terrible tragedy.
But now he knows, so.
Exactly. It takes time. You really got to have all the ingredients to do it right.
That's great. Well, Morgan in the audience wanted to know what advice you had for anyone applying to be a Schwartzman Scholar.
Ooh, Schwartzman. Let's see. Defining the thread of leadership is a really big one. Leadership is a very big thing for the program, and understanding particularly how you conceptualize leadership and being able to define that both in terms of language on a paper for your application, but also in your experiences. So not leadership as in, I did this experience and this experience, but actually, over this like 5-year period, the positions that I have taken and the types of experiences I've pursued have actually emphasized leadership in this area. And also, I think diversity of thought is a really big one. Schwartzman is a very, very diverse place. And there's a lot of space, often both between people and how they approach the world, which really gives you a lot of really interesting opportunities for conversations.
Thank you. That's great. And I want to just throw in there really quick, if anybody has a question once we finish that they forgot to ask, feel free to reach out to Josh or myself, and we'll make sure we get it to Jesse if he's willing to follow up. We did have 2 questions put together. So they said the first one you touched on a bit, but how exactly did you cultivate the network to enter this field after becoming a transfer student? And how do you think COVID will affect opportunities for the coming future?
So I'll start with the first one, with the latter on COVID. So it's harder because a lot of internships and stuff are no longer in person. Like DC is quite empty right now. That said, if you have the summer, you don't even have to leave your house to have a really dope internship doing really interesting work for really interesting people. And because of geography, you're not limited to where. So, I have friends here that are, Schwarzman Scholars and people from other programs that I've been a part of who are pursuing jobs and internships remotely. They might be doing work for the UN, they might be doing work for a company in China, they might be doing work for a think tank in DC, but living in Georgia. So if you approach it from that framework, you actually have a much bigger range of places you can apply because frankly, no one's really working in person right now. So that gives you a greater breadth of places you can pursue. And because COVID is a global issue, there's going to be greater interactions between the type of work that you're doing. So you're going to get a much more, I think, comprehensive experience. And I think the type of work that you're going to be engaging in, depending on what you're pursuing, is going to be much more substantive because you are working from home. And I don't think the work that you'd be doing is limited to like editing essays, right? Or papers. I think because people are going to need that expertise now, and there's opportunities for it. That said, it's also going to be more competitive because more people are pursuing these opportunities. So I think those two things are something you have to balance. But I do know that, I mean, Fulbright they've pushed back, I think, to January for this current cohort, and they're working for the next cohort as we speak. I think that opens up next week, you said. So, I mean, if you're applying for research, what an interesting opportunity to talk about the impact of COVID on X in X country. I mean, there's a lot of space in the post-COVID period to look at how COVID has impacted a numerous number of fields. I think my sister could probably speak to, for example, the impact of COVID on entrepreneurship, venture startups, and that kind of stuff. So if you start reading now, for example, do an internship if you want to do Fulbright on something like this. Do an internship, look at a topic, gain some expertise in it, go do research on it. I mean, honestly, it's a clean slate in that sense, because no one knows what the implications of X, Y, or Z are on the post-COVID period. On the first one as a transfer student, honestly, it was a mix of things. For me, comfortable was dealing with international students because I'd worked with refugees for quite a while. So I went to the areas of FSU that I was comfortable with. So for me, the Middle East, the Arabic-speaking community, and the international community. To me, that was kind of where I built my base of relationships. And then over time, I think it was a mix of I think dealing with imposter syndrome, as I began to level out on my imposter syndrome and was more engaged across campus, I was able to pursue more opportunities. So if you're a transfer student, honestly, I think the best way is find the areas that you're passionate about and honestly just reach out and start working in. It'll be really annoying and probably unnerving at first for the first week, 2-3 weeks, but people at FSU are really friendly. Honestly, it's a great community. And then student government came through. When I was working and I was teaching a class actually for an international community, at the Center for Intensive English, and some folks from student government came out and listened. They're like, "Oh, this is really interesting. We don't have a lot of international student engagement at the student government. Would you be interested in representing us or helping build this?" And I got involved in student government. So just be willing be willing and open to new opportunities. And if you don't find any of the opportunities you like, start them. There's a lot of resources to do that at FSU. I forget how many student organizations there are. But I mean, start them. I guarantee you'll find at least 5 other people who are interested, and you can build from there. And I've seen that, turn from projects we were working on with refugees back in 2013 and 14 turn into an entire resettlement office when IRC moved in. So you can have a huge opportunity of growth even if you're there for 2 years to shape the trajectory of whatever you want to do. But it's not easy as a transfer student. It's not easy. If there's one thing I think that there's space to grow in for FSU, it is integrating students, transfer students, into the broader community. I think when I was there, I think it was the honors college didn't allow transfer students admissions. However, that's changed, I believe, since. Mm-hmm. So that's been a really big and increasing direction. And this is there are new movements and opportunities within higher education in general, which are working. There's a few students that reached out to me recently who are doing some really innovative work, both within State Department and within different government agencies, to actually create fellowships specifically for transfer students, similar to Gilman, but to try to bring in groups like first-generation college students as well as transfer students from community colleges into government through these pathways. So there's a lot that's happening now. Mm-hmm. But I mean, what a great opportunity. You guys can actually help shape those opportunities at FSU.
Yeah, and thank you. That's really great advice for a lot of our transfer students. So thank you.
No worries.
Eric is wrapping it up with a couple questions for us. Eric in the audience. We have first, what was your Arabic proficiency level before and after Boren? And then which institute did you study Arabic at while in Jordan?
Excellent. I'm assuming this is someone who's looking at applying for Boren. So when I went there, the plate of options for studying Arabic was much more limited. However, after the Arab Spring kind of settled down, other options began to reemerge, and a lot of places moved to Jordan. So I studied at the Costed Institute, where I think most people end up at. And I went to Boren with, I think I went through 2 years of Arabic at FSU. If Dr. Zane is here, she can correct me. I think it was 2 years. But I had students in my cohort who had, 1 semester. So it really ranges, versus like we had people in our program who were like in the highest class they had a cost on their first semester. I'm like, well, this is just, I was like dead middle. So I think I was probably like mid intermediate. However, I left at around, I think, upper advanced. And that was of course, in Fusha or in standard dialects. So there are differences between whether you're studying formal or dialect. And my formal got pretty good, but then because I work mostly with local community Syrians and stuff, my dialect increased and my formal Arabic went down. So if I was taking a government exam, I probably wouldn't score as high as I did in Boren, but I can communicate better with people on the ground than I've ever been able to. So it's kind of a trade-off depending what your needs are at. So if you're applying for Boren, and your research interest is predicated toward, for example, you want to do historical research, or you want to do something more related to like immediate analysis of texts, you're going to want to prioritize written Arabic, like Fusha, versus if you want to do something that's more refugee engaging, if you want to do work on gender or in a refugee camp, depending on what you want to do, Ami is going to be equally important, so dialect. And then you're going to want to write your application talking about, the need for both, but like particularly in your work, X center will allow me to do this. For example, COST will allow me to do this while, pursuing other areas to become specialized in dialect Arabic so that I can engage in these areas. So just one way to kind of conceptualize those two things.
Awesome.
And I'm also happy to send a more updated list of Arabic centers in Jordan. I think I have a more updated list.
Okay. Yeah, and then Eric had one more question. He wanted to know, what was the desire to attend Cambridge centered around obtaining an international perspective or just personal preference? For example, why not Harvard, Georgetown, Yale, or Princeton, etc.?
So many answers. I think the first and easiest one is I was really interested in the British School of Thought and political science. The US side, if you want to go into political science in a way that is highly quantitative, much more like methodologically research tends to be more data driven, big data, and particularly when it comes to like election reviews and stuff. I was more interested in the IR sense, and even within that, I had never taken a political theory course when I was at Florida State, so that was a big gap in my experience. And Cambridge is one of the centers of political thought historically. So I mean, we can be, we'd be sitting in a room. It's like, oh yeah, Edward Said, taught his last lecture here before he passed away. Like really crazy stuff, particularly within the political field. But the other part of that is I'm terrible at standardized testing, and I did not want to take the GRE. Yeah, there was a trade-off between, because I was on Fulbright at the time, and I was looking for that experience to blend in directly into another one, so I didn't have a long period of unemployment. And for me, like doing the GRE would have meant taking away time that was really special on the ground in Jordan. Rather than applying for the GRE, I was, communicating with people on the ground in Eastern Syria. I was at the time, doing some research with Refugees International, ended up writing a paper with the vice president. So like there's a lot of, it's a trade-off. Plus the UK was awesome. At my college, we would, our graduate common room where we'd relax and like socialize was the Darwin family manor. Nice. So just nothing like having a pint in Darwin's house.
Yeah, I wouldn't know, but it sounds like it.
It's fantastic. It's fantastic, like the history and culture of those institutions. Yeah.
Great. Well, I think it is your sister who is going to cap us off with the last question for you. So there are many Boren scholars who graduate and then have to face the service requirement for 1 year. With the guidelines for what counts as approved service being limited and scholars and fellows often struggling to find something that will fulfill this service, what advice would you give to applicants for consideration in post-fellowship environment?
That's changing because of COVID. I feel like, Madison, you should give an answer about your own experience as you fulfilled yours. But for me specifically, I waited. You have 3 years. And if you have a general idea of what you want to do, if you're interested in a career in government, I chose specifically to pursue graduate studies because you can defer your service requirement start date if you're pursuing further education. And the benefit of that is you can move in at a higher level and you can have a higher salary. So in terms of longevity, if you go in at a specific level, you might basically be an entry level position, and it gives you, a continuity being able to work up. But having a master's degree definitely gives you an edge in some degrees, but it also gives you more experiences and opportunities to pursue other fellowships, to pursue other experiences. Like, you have 3 years, you can make that 3 years into 5 years if you do a master's. And honestly, going into a service requirement right after Boren or right after undergrad, as opposed to going in after a master's, you learn a lot about the world. You learn a lot about yourself. It's your 20s, so you're learning every year something new about yourself. I understand at home, and sometimes getting a job is a priority to help, support families and stuff. That being said, if that is your case, there are significant resources that I would look at both within Boren, but also within different agencies for Boren. For example, I didn't know that several of the agencies that I had initially wanted to work for that I couldn't get a role in with PMF because they just weren't offering. We're actually offering Boren jobs. And I think being in tune and realizing there's not one specific method to go into the government opportunities. But yeah, I mean, if you can pursue, if you can defer to pursue other studies or other areas, I mean, I definitely encourage it. And if none of the areas in federal government interest you, there are those tier 2 and tier 3 jobs. Find ones that will allow you to do work that is interesting to you, that allows you to fulfill your service requirement. I think Madison can also speak to that because she did hers in a more distinctive way than I think I'm going about.
Well, thank you, and thank you both. And I just want to thank you from my work in alumni relations for just taking the time to share all of your information with students today, because it's alumni like you that help our students really find their purpose and their calling. So thank you so much. And I'm going to hand it back over to Josh.
Yeah, thank you for having me. It's a pleasure.
I do, Madison. If you're up for it, we would love to hear your perspective, and if you wouldn't mind also plugging working with the program. But if you wanted to drop, just mention to a few of these folks in our program, definitely be open to hearing your thoughts.
Oh, sure. I'm not going to turn on my video because it's midnight right now in Dubai. But hi, everyone. I think Jesse provided a lot of great answers. I took a little bit of a non-traditional route in deciding not to go into government after doing the Boren Scholarship. So I actually was able to, I worked for a company called Qatar Foundation International, which was filling a gap that the federal government had. So the government used to have money for K-12 schools to have Arabic programs, and they pulled that funding. So the foundation I was working for was working with public schools. So I was actually able to write a letter and justify why that should count. So they are flexible if you can't find a role. And the other thing I did was I led the critical language scholarship and the Nestle Y programs in Jordan, and that time also counted. So you can use your experience later on as a resident director, for example. So my experience in Jordan was foundational and actually enabled me to go back twice and actually lead the programs. So Eric, you asked about MINAR. The Middle East North Africa Regional Fellowship Program is like Princeton in Asia. We provide a few placements in Tunis, Morocco, and Jordan. And we have basically partnered with organizations like Bait.com or the Collateral Repair Project to provide one-year fellowship opportunities for students to gain full-time work experience. It's one of the only programs that just allows students who want to work and gain experience to have a foot in the door. So we have a competitive process. Applications open from October through December. I'll be honest, right now we're doing a reassessment of what that looks like because of COVID-19 and just some other moving factors. So stay tuned to the website for more updates. But I would definitely have a research project that you want to do. The Princeton in Asia, Princeton in Africa, and MINAR fellowship programs are great ways to get your foot in the door. You get a stipend to help you support yourself on the ground, and you're treated as a full employee of the company. And most of the fellows have continued on and been able to find positions in the region. So, you know, it's a great entry point. And with sometimes the Minar team, we actually help students who might not consider a certain career. We look at their strengths and say, look, if you're interested in being a product manager, you'll get to practice your Arabic every day and apply a lot of your skills in relationship management and strategy. And so we've had students also pivot careers with some of the fellowships that they've had. So if anyone has any questions, feel free to reach out.
Thank you so much, Madison. Yeah, and actually, I guess this is just a perfect time to thank everyone for attending. There's a lot are being adjusted by some pressing issues in the present, and so I appreciate everyone feeling like they could take the time to like hear from an alumni, of which you all will be not too long from now. If you don't mind, I know clapping isn't necessarily, yeah, thank you. Yeah, if we can do like the clap reaction to let Jesse.
No, not at all.
Their time with us. And we record this, and so you'll be able to watch it later if you'd like. We also have your contact information, and so you'll just be getting an email letting you thank you all for coming. And so that's an opportunity if you do want to have a conversation with us to set up from there. But thank you all for coming. I hope you and your family and your loved ones are well. And thank you again for Jesse and the surprise visit from Madison to talk about your experiences as FSU students and where you've been since then. Thank you all.
Thank you for the opportunity, for the invitation. It's really lovely getting to meet all of you, and hopefully get to meet some of the attendees soon. Look forward to hearing from you.